Welcome back to Teach English Now. In this next module, we want to discuss an important language teaching principle that comes from understanding the difference between acquisition and learning. While both can be good, in learning languages there is a big difference between acquisition and learning, and the two concepts don't really get along. In one corner, you have learning. Learning involves the ability to comprehend and recall information as it is given to you, much like what occurs for most classes. You read from a book, you have discussions, you try to understand the principles, and show your understanding through some kind of testing. In the other corner, you have acquisition. Acquisition is much more than simple learning. Acquisition means that you not only learn, but apply those principles in the real world. And when it comes to language learning, acquisition is truly the only way to measure student success. This means that you are able to not only understand and recognize vocabulary, words, and grammar tenses, but you can also use the linguistic structures you have learned in a way that is fluid and automatic. In some sense, the idea behind acquisition is that after you leave the comfy confines of a classroom, you can actually use the language you were given to speak, write, listen, and read in real contexts and under real circumstances. Thus, in language teaching, acquisition wins over learning every time. In the next few videos, we will discuss some principles and methods that will help you ensure your students are acquiring language and not just learning it. Thanks for watching. Hello again. In this lesson, we are going to continue our discussion of acquired language, language you can actually use, by discussing two different modes of learning. H. Douglas Brown introduces the idea of two different types of learning by using the metaphor of a camera. For Brown, using language is like using a camera that has two different lenses, a zoom lens and a wide-angle lens. When you are learning a language through a zoom lens, you are focusing in on a very small, specific linguistic form, like a vocabulary word, the past tense, or a small pronunciation rule. However, when you are in a wide-angle lens mode of learning, you're trying to understand an overall general meaning, or trying to convey a message without worrying so much about every small rule of grammar, vocabulary, or pronunciation. And Brown isn't the only one who talks about two distinct modes of learning. Barbara Oakley, who teaches the famous online course Learning How to Learn, explains this by describing two different ways to focus your learning. One she calls the focused mode, and the other the diffuse mode of learning. In a focused mode, you concentrate and look very specifically at certain tasks, such as reading a chapter in the textbook. She recommends focusing for a specific length of time, like 25 minutes, when in a focused mode. The diffuse mode, however, is a time to let your mind wander and make connections that it otherwise wouldn't make when you focus too narrowly. As a teacher, one of your jobs will be to sometimes help students narrow in on a specific feature of their language, often that they haven't been paying attention to, but other times having them step back and not pay attention to every single mistake. By stepping back, you will help learners understand overall structure and meaning as they communicate and gain fluency. In this sense, language is a camera, and you are the photographer, moving the students back and forth between two modes of learning. In the next video, we are going to have a very special guest deepen our understanding of these two modes. Thanks for watching. Hi, my name is Michael Jordan, and I am excited to teach you how to play basketball. Are you excited? Of course you are! I am Michael Jordan. Let me just explain a little bit about how we're going to learn in my class. First of all, I've written a new book called How to Play Basketball Like Michael Jordan. I've divided the class into 10 different sections that correspond with the 10 different chapters of my book. Sounds fun, right? Each chapter is 100 pages long, and in each chapter, we'll go over 100 rules. For example, in Chapter 1, we will learn 100 rules for how to dribble. In Chapter 2, 100 rules for how to shoot. And Chapter 3, 100 rules for bounce and chest passes. My personal favorite, Chapter 10, 100 rules for how to slam dunk. I will give you a test each Friday to go over the 100 rules of each of these chapters, just to make sure you all know how to do every rule. If you study hard, and I know you will get an A on each test. And by the end of this course, you will be able to play basketball just like me. Right? What? You don't think so? Well, why not? All right. The real Michael Jordan would never have made the mistake you just saw dramatized. He knows, as I am sure is clear by his level of play, that he didn't just memorize a bunch of rules. What do you need to become a great basketball player? Certainly, you need good coaching, and there is no doubt you want to master the rules of the game. But the word that probably came to your mind by watching fake Michael Jordan is the word practice. And when you think of practice in a language classroom, you're starting to gain some perspective on what we mean by acquisition. Acquisition refers to the ability to put into practice the ability to interact with others in a real language environment in order to convey meaning and ideas that will be useful to communicate information. After all, that's what language is for. While test-taking and learning in a focused mode can be useful for language learning, it simply isn't enough. In fact, many people have taken years of language classes without ever really acquiring the language. Think about this. I took Spanish in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade, all in an effort to try to connect with my Mexican heritage. Notice the Spanish bolo tie. I really wanted to learn Spanish to speak to my grandparents in Mexico, and I studied hard. In fact, I got A's in every class I took. I studied the textbooks, I read all the rules, and I memorized all the vocabulary. And while my teachers tried to give me some assignments to engage in real communicative activities, I would say that the majority of time, let's say 80%, was spent in learning the rules of Spanish. I'm embarrassed to admit now, as a language professional, that while taking those Spanish classes, I never considered my mother, a native Spanish speaker, and my father, a Spanish teacher, as resources to practice what I was learning in class. In fact, I never connected the classroom as a place where I learned anything that connected to the real world. What a wasted opportunity and a lack of understanding. So your job as a teacher is to not only teach language through grammar rules, drills, and worksheets, but to encourage students to have opportunities to practice the rules and language you give them, and not just once, but many times. Just like basketball, acquired skills are those that fade over time, meaning that if you don't use it, you lose it. And just because you teach it doesn't mean they learn it. Learning the skills to actually use language comes through practice. Perhaps a simple rule of thumb to help you combat the problem of practice is the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 principle suggests that practice should be the majority of what is learned in class, 80%. Whereas 20% of the time, you can flip to that zoom lens mode, provide instruction and details that will allow them to focus in on things they have not yet noticed or seen. In this way, you can certainly see that language is basketball, and you are the coach. Yet another metaphor to store away and help you understand some of the fundamental principles in Teach English Now. In the next video, we'll help guide you to see some of the best ways to engage students in deliberate practice. Thanks for watching. Welcome back. In this lesson, we'd like to build your knowledge of the two different modes of learning and give you some simple tips on how to help students practice in both modes. First, let's start with the focused mode of learning. The focused mode, you'll recall, is one in which students need to zoom in on the details of learning. For example, it might be learning from a vocabulary list, practicing a particular tense, or working on the pronunciation of a group of similar sounding words. Small things, focused. Now, as a teacher, how would you help students tackle these kinds of assignments? Well, one of the worst things you can do when encouraging learners to memorize is to simply force them to sit down and try to learn everything at once. Some of my students insist that if it is good to learn 20 words in a day, it must be better to learn 40. And if 40 is great, why not 80 in one day? The problem with this idea is it gives no time for the brain to process the information. It is a little like believing that if you can bake a cake at 350 degrees for 1 hour, then you can bake that same cake at 700 degrees in 30 minutes. It'll save time, right? Of course not. If you double the temperature, what happens? You got it, burnt cake. And if you double the amount of information, you may end up frying your brain. For your brain to truly learn words and keep them, learners need to allow their brain time to process the information. One great way to do this is to use spaced repetition. Spaced repetition is a particularly good technique for learners when they are trying to memorize lists. Rather than learning all the words at once, and considering the learning finished, learners are invited to spend a limited amount of time with the material, and then come back to it at a later time. Each time the learner comes back to it, however, the amount of time between intervals increases. This allows for the learning to stick and become more automatic. There are many different systems people use for spaced repetition. But one of my favorite systems for spaced repetition is the Lightner system. In this system, you practice items you haven't learned more frequently than those you have already memorized. For example, if I was studying vocabulary words on flashcards, words I correctly answered would go into a box with a higher number and would be studied less frequently, while words I incorrectly answered would go into a box with a lower number, meaning they would be studied more frequently. And remember, you don't have to come up with systems yourself. A simple Google search will reveal many different systems for spaced repetition, along with computer software and websites all designed to help you memorize things more quickly and easily. These software and websites usually let you create your own lists or look at lists other teachers have created. I like to look for lists that I know will help my students learn about a specific, targeted group of words I want them to know. And if you aren't into serious kinds of spaced repetition, here is an even easier tip. When you do practice of a particular group of words during a week of instruction, please remember to try to use those words in upcoming weeks. Just giving students lists, having students memorize those lists, and then leaving all that learning alone will simply cause students to believe that learning a language is nothing more than memorizing, taking a test, going home, and taking a shower that erases all that knowledge away. You know what I'm talking about. Don't do it. Recycle those words throughout the semester. Have them reappear throughout your time together. Now let's talk about the diffuse mode. To practice the diffuse mode in class, engage students in activities that move them beyond a list of words or a single rule. This means that you will need to zoom out and create general, not specific, tasks for your learners. Creating a general task means you aren't asking them to perform a memorized bit of vocabulary or grammar, but asking them to perform in a more open style. For example, you could ask students to order at a restaurant, buy some shoes, or talk about your best friend. Do you see how these are more general tasks? Do you notice that in these tasks, there is more than one right answer, and that students could talk for a short or long period of time? These tasks could all include different kinds of grammar and vocabulary, and invite learners to communicate in real, unscripted ways. At advanced levels of English, teachers often challenge students to think critically by asking questions that require students to synthesize, put together what they are learning. For example, by pairing two apparently unrelated ideas, you can invite students to consider how they might be related. Let me give you an example. The theme of our first module, motivation, and let's tie it to the theme of our second module, practice. I could ask you, advanced English speakers, a question like this: how is practice related to motivation? By taking these two separate ideas, practice and motivation, and asking students to put them together, you now engage students in not just language production, but critical thinking. Here, students will naturally focus away from grammar and from details of what vocabulary words they know, and focus on what they think, feel, and believe. Suddenly, they will get lost in the task and start speaking in a free way. Trust me, there is no more real context you can provide than asking students to engage in critical thought and serious reflection. Now you're talking. Can you think of any other times we have employed the technique of putting two unrelated ideas together in order to help learners think? How is language like cake? How is it like a camera? How is language like basketball? I think you get the idea. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to Teach English Now. Today, we are going to talk about something called the affective filter and its relation to self-awareness. Do you know what it means to be self-aware? Self-awareness is the ability to see yourself, Or perhaps imagine yourself from someone else's viewpoint, kind of like seeing yourself in a mirror. Self-awareness is something that evolves over time, meaning that kids are usually less self-aware and adults more self-aware. Now, let me ask you an impossible question. I love impossible questions. Is it good or bad to be self-aware? Well, let's think about it. On the positive side, self-awareness gives you the chance to know how you look, how you feel, why you feel what you feel. You have a certain amount of confidence because you know you look and sound pretty good. On the negative side, self-awareness can sometimes be paralyzing. Sometimes, and especially in new environments, you think so much about yourself, who you are, and what you are doing that you have increased anxiety and lose your confidence. Can you tell it's time for another story? When I was 16 years old, I had big glasses, big hair, and a big dream. I wanted to be a singer, and a group called the Music Machine was a nationally recognized glee club that for some reason, girls, I wanted to be a part of. The day before my audition, my friend Joseph invited me to his house so that I could memorize one of my audition songs, Under the Sea. I sang it about a half dozen times to 60-second perfection. When I arrived to my audition the next day, I got onto a stage for the very first time. Does anyone else here remember a first audition? Well, let me tell you what it looked like for me. The music director and choreographer sat behind a table in the back of a long, dark auditorium. On the table was a microphone, and directly beside the table and the two people was a large stage light. When I walked onto the stage, I already had butterflies in my stomach. The director spoke, and the microphone crackled. "Whenever you're ready," he said. The music began, and I had 60 seconds to convince them that I could sing. The problem was, I was so frightened I couldn't remember a single line. In fact, earlier that day, I had started forgetting my lines to the point that I had everything written on my hands. Now, with that stage light directly in my face, I couldn't even read what was on my hands because sweat had begun to smear the words. So what did I do? I stood there, staring into my hands, letting the 60 seconds of music go by me as I awkwardly tried to stammer out a few nonsensical words to a song originally sung by a crab. Please remember my age. I was 16 years old, and I desperately wanted to be cool. And this was about the not coolest thing I had ever experienced. I was convinced that anyone that saw me would have thought I had absolutely no business ever being on a stage. Now, what does this have to do with learning a language? And what does it have to do with self-awareness? I share this story, which otherwise would be just a bad memory, to illustrate a feeling I believe many of your learners share. In many ways, learning a new language gives students a peculiar kind of self-awareness. In language learning, self-awareness means you are aware of your accent, your grammar mistakes, and how well you are doing at communicating your idea. In a sense, learning a language is a lot like being on a stage. And learners are trying to perform something for the first time, and that can be very uncomfortable. Stephen Krashen, our famous ESL theorist, explains this concept using the term affective filter. The affective filter, he explains, refers to the complex emotions your students might have as they process all this new information and try to produce language. In short, when your affective filter is high, it means you are feeling a lot of emotions: annoyance, anger, frustration, or anxiety. And when your affective filter is low, it means you aren't nearly so stressed, so the flow of information can come more easily. Let's discuss. During my audition, what level was my affective filter? It was off the charts. I couldn't even remember simple things that I had accomplished very easily the day before. having to produce what I already knew became impossible because I focused so much on myself and my possible mistakes that I couldn't remember a thing. So what does this mean for you as a language teacher? Well, let's start with the fact that we, as language teachers, can never forget how hard it is to learn and perform something new, and how difficult it can be to perform in front of those that are judging us. Recognize that the affective filter, especially in classroom settings, can be particularly high, and that you as a teacher must create an environment to help lower that filter and give learners confidence to remember the material that they have prepared and studied. In the next few videos, we will discuss some very effective ways to lower the affective filter and invite students to take more risks. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to Teach English Now. In the last video, we discussed the concept of taking risks and how important it is for a teacher to lower the affective filter so that students want to take risks. Hand in hand with that thought, however, is the need for a learner to know the proper ways to take risk. In other words, helping students learn correct language learner strategies will help give them more confidence, more motivation, and ultimately better language skills. While I said that risk is good, not all risk is created equal. One more story. Francois Guan, smart or foolish? That is the question we must ask ourselves in today's story. Here are the facts. Francois Guan lived at the end of the 19th century and was a Latin and Greek professor from France. Sounds pretty smart so far, right? He also wrote books, and he was considered a predecessor of Charles Berlitz, who revolutionized language learning in his day. Perhaps Guan's most famous book, The Art and Teaching of Language, is something I think every language teacher should read, not only because of his ideas about language learning, but because of his experiences in trying to learn language himself. You see, just around 1880, Francois decided he wanted to learn German. So he left his teaching position for an entire year and moved to Hamburg, Germany. Good idea? Smart? I think so. He then spent the first 10 days doing what? Studying German in his room. Good idea? Smart? While in his room for 10 days, he first learned 248 irregular German verbs, studied a grammar book, and he refused to leave until he had committed it all to memory. Wow! After 10 days, he left his room and finally tried to test out his knowledge. He went to the university and listened in on classes. How do you think he did? Could he understand German? Not at all. In fact, he phrases it like this: "Not a word, not a single word would penetrate to my understanding. Nay, more than this, I did not even distinguish a single one of the grammatical forms so newly studied. I did not recognize even a single one of the irregular verbs just freshly learnt, though they certainly must have fallen in crowds from the lips of the speaker." So, Francois went back to his room and shut the door again for another 8 days. This time, he memorized 800 German roots and committed to memory the grammar book and irregular verbs again. And off to the university again. And, any guesses? Could he understand any words this time? Not a word. Now, I don't want to be too hard on poor Guan at this point. I admit there are things I admire. He keeps trying, he never gives up, but he also keeps using the same strategy. Finally, this third time, he tries to change the strategy. Oh, how I love that. What does he do now? Is it smart? Let me tell you what he does. He goes down to a shop below his room. He actually leaves the room and tries talking with customers in the shop. He opens his mouth, tries to say a few things. Unfortunately, they laugh at him. This makes things even worse. Poor, sensitive Francois, a professor, a genius, looks silly, just like every one of us learning a new language. Do you think as a professor of languages, he was used to looking ridiculous? I don't either. In fact, do you think it is possible that sometimes being smart is what makes you foolish? Food for thought. Anyway, the story ends rather tragically. Guan, super embarrassed, returns to his room and tries translations. Doesn't work. Then he tries memorizing a book of dialogues. Nope, not that either. Then he spends a month memorizing 30,000 words in a dictionary. Nothing. Not a word. After 1 year of effort, guess what? Francois Guan goes home, having never learned German at all. Not a word. Now, what does this story illustrate, and what can we learn from it? It certainly re-emphasizes the idea that practice is an important part of language learning, and that memorizing simply isn't enough. Sure, that's true. But it also illustrates another point I'd like to make about language learners in general. First, everyone likes to look smart. And people like Francois Guan, adult learners of a language, are accustomed to looking smart. Second, because learners are accustomed to looking smart, they often choose language learning strategies that avoid looking foolish and taking risk. This is not to say that all his strategies are necessarily bad, but rather that in the absence of risk, his strategies are likely to increase learning, but not acquisition, which is our ultimate goal. Thanks for watching Teach English Now. We have shared a few stories now about how not to learn a language, and the strategies learners often use that don't seem to work very well. In the next video, however, we will start presenting how good language learners use strategies that allow them to be more successful than their counterparts. See you then. Welcome back. As I mentioned before, I love to share stories about language learners. I do this so that students can get a sense that they are not alone, which in turn can lower the effective filter. Please feel free to learn about some of my extraordinary students by reading some of their stories in the bonus material at the end of this module. In their stories, they share their frustrations and difficulties in learning a new language and culture. Having your learners read stories about what was successful and not successful is an excellent way to help your learners examine and broaden their own language learner strategies. For example, after I teach students about Francois Guan, I often invite students to think about what strategies he should have used. Another useful way to help students use successful strategies is by looking at the good language learner studies. A number of studies have tried to identify what good language learners do and what cognitive and metacognitive strategies they employ in order to be successful. While not every strategy is expected to be successful for every student, helping language learners know which strategies are likely to be more successful can be an extremely liberating process and give students motivation to take more risk. Good language learners predict. Good language learners will often guess or be invited to guess what the topic will be about. Students who are good at picking up on social and contextual clues often become better language learners. Use selective attention. Good language learners often pay attention to only a particular aspect of a lesson. They will decide in advance to ignore distracting information and pay attention only to what they believe is important. Prepare. Learners who prepare in advance often do better. For example, a learner who writes down notes about what he or she wants to say generally will excel over a student who simply tries to speak with no preparation. Look ridiculous. Learners who are willing to look foolish often make better language students. They don't worry about what they look like. They focus on the task and try to accomplish it. Practice. Learners who practice are better able to master the skill of language. Practice should be at the core of any real language class. Monitor. Monitoring refers to correction of your own speech for accuracy in pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, and appropriateness. A learner who pays attention to both form and meaning is often the best language learner. Ask questions. Learners who learn to ask questions to those around them and get answers to those questions are more likely to be successful. Take notes. Learners who write down what they hear and discuss are more likely to remember and better able to retain. Use imagery. Learners who relate new information to a visualization often perform better, especially at recall. Find an answer in multiple ways. Good language learners are able to find answers from dictionaries, teachers, students, and other sources. They don't get information from just one source. Use physical response. Good language learners can relate information, such as new vocabulary, to a physical action, and this helps deepen memory. Play. Good language learners practice reordering a meaningful sentence by using words in a new way. They play with language. Now, did you notice that as we went through these strategies, that some of the good language learner strategies are similar to good teacher strategies? Even if your learners never actively learn any of these strategies, you can still encourage the use of them within your classroom. Help students predict, ask questions, use imagery, and play. Well, that's it for today's lesson. By the way, this leads us to our next metaphor about teachers. We hope you'll agree that learners need to know not just what to learn, but how to learn. And as a language teacher, you play a serious role in helping give them correct strategies. In a sense, you are guiding them along a correct path by encouraging them to go in certain directions. So the metaphor we want you to remember is that, as a teacher, you are often a trail guide, helping your learners along a path with obstacles and choices. You help learners to avoid certain pitfalls that Francois fell into and discover strategies that they should use instead. Thanks for watching Teach English Now.